not mean you will get those hostage files back just because you pay. Sometimes there's honor amongst thieves, and should you pay? No, of course not. You shouldn't be in a situation where you have to. Now, we need to be very careful about this. Backups, good antivirus, web and email filtering, absolutely. Again, just because it's paid does not mean it isn't a breach. OCR made it official last year, ransomware attacks are HIPAA breaches. It's frustrating because I would argue in the old days and win the argument with the government stating, look, it's true the virus got on the server. It's true the virus encrypted the database. But the bad guy didn't log in to the application and see Billy Bob's health information. Doesn't matter. Not anymore. Government says don't care because unauthorized individuals have taken possession or control of the protected health information constituting an unauthorized disclosure. Unless, this is very important, if your data is encrypted at rest already, it would not be a breach. So how do we protect ourselves? Number one, good technology, obviously. Number two, education. That's an administrative safeguard. Everyone from the CEO down to the part-time medical biller needs to be trained on common cybersecurity threats. Number three, if possible, encrypt the file shares on your server and make sure the database is encrypted. This isn't required under HIPAA because it's not always possible to encrypt a database. It's just not possible sometimes. But if you can, you really want to do that. So let's talk about some risks. Avoid opening unverified emails. And one thing some groups do, and I highly recommend this, especially for larger groups, you can hire your IT folks or even third parties to do what's known as a controlled phishing expedition against your organization, meaning you let these fake emails through and whoever clicks on them in the organization has to get retrained. Like you let all these phishing style emails like from Microsoft, Apple, Facebook, PayPal, Bank of America, whoever, that they're fake. They're trying to trick you or entice you into clicking on something. And you see who falls for the trick, they got to get retrained. Back up your files, 3-2-1 approach. 3 backup copies on 2 different media with one in a separate location not connected to your systems. That's to protect not only from a potential ransomware situation, but also for disaster recovery purposes. Now, of course, good updates, software programs, applications have the latest and greatest vulnerability updates, especially the browser, antivirus, and operating system. Access controls, good, strong access controls. Who are you letting into your system? Everyone needs their own individual username and password to log in. Good 8-character complex passwords. When you let your partners in, business associates, they should be coming in through the exact same mechanisms and security as a normal staff member, individual logins. And again, don't go cheap on the technology. Avoid unsecure websites. Don't leave your passwords laying around where anyone can see it. Never transmit your usernames and passwords unencrypted. Be sure to have a backup copy of your system, of course. So social engineering, I want to show you an example of what a phishing email looks like. And again, what don't ever, and get training on this. Don't open emails from untrusted sources. You want a good spam filter to filter most of this. Be sure to contact a friend or family member. If you receive a weird email address from a coworker, pick up the phone and call them. Don't give offers to benefit strangers. When you get offers online, seem too good to be true, they are. Lock your laptop when you are away from workstation. Good technology, remember, it's not going to stop everything. But if you're not using business-grade technology, that is not reasonable and appropriate in the eyes of the federal government with this law. I've been through this over and over and over. Don't use consumer-grade equipment. Don't use consumer-grade antivirus. consumer-grade firewalls. Don't do it. So phishing is basically a fake email that's trying to trick you into clicking on something or threaten you into clicking on something for various reasons, to download ransomware, to steal information, all sorts of things. So here's one from Facebook, not really from them, just someone pretending to be, saying that you have some kind of copyrights problem linked to your account. They want you to fill out this link, because if you don't, you will be permanently blocked. There's their threat. These things come in all different shapes and sizes. They're beginning to look more and more realistic, so be very careful what you click on and what you see coming through email. So there's been a good bit going on with texting and emailing that I want to talk about. There have been some pretty profound changes relating to email. You have a lot more liberty than you might think, especially with dealing with patients. So does HIPAA permit us to use email to discuss health issues and treatment with patients or even provider to provider? Yeah, absolutely. This law is not intended to cripple our ability to communicate. It's not. It's intended to put in reasonable safeguards. The question is, what's reasonable? How do we quantify that? So certain precautions may need to be taken when using email to avoid unintentional disclosures, like obviously making sure we confirm the email address is accurate before sending an email or sending an email alert to the patient for address confirmation. Now, while HIPAA does not prohibit the use of unencrypted email for provider-patient communications or in general, encryption is not required, it's addressable. Other safeguards, however, need to be applied to reasonably protect privacy, such as abiding by the minimum necessary principle, only sending limited amount of information through an email. Like if a doctor requests an ulnar bone x-ray to be sent, you send the x-ray of the ulnar bone, not the entire health record. We got to be very careful with the type of information that we disclose through an unencrypted email. Now, if it's directly to the patient with consent, doesn't matter. But when you're talking about non-encrypted emails between business to provider, you need to be very careful. Never send stuff like an HIV record, a substance abuse record, name, address, social security number, credit card numbers. Those sorts of things. Mental health information should never be sent through non-encrypted means. Way too risky, way too many identifiers. But if it's just a medical record number, which is protected health information, or it's just an x-ray of a tooth, generally acceptable because of the nature and the limited amount of information that is, albeit still protected health information. Now, what if a patient initiates a conversation? There's some new regulations. Well, actually, more patient rights, I should say. Then, if a patient communicates with you through text or through email, that's implied consent, technically. But you need to let them know this is not a secured way to communicate. Are you sure you want to communicate this way? Very important. Make sure they understand it's not secured. In fact, I would have some kind of confidential electronic communications form in your new patient packet that I, Brian, want to communicate with the practice through email, texting, heck, even FaceTime or Skype. Some therapists and counselors use the FaceTime Skype type technology, which is not, quote, HIPAA compliant, but if the patient wants to communicate that way, they understand the risks, you can do that, absolutely. Now, hypothetically, while we are communicating with these patients, through non-encrypted means based on their request and a breach happens, then what do? Are we responsible? No, absolutely not. While we are responsible for adopting, quote, reasonable safeguards, such as entering the correct email address in, if we sent it to the wrong email address, then yeah, that's a different story. But we are not responsible for a disclosure of PHI while in transmission to the individual based on the individual's access request to receive the PHI in an unsecured manner, assuming they were warned of and accepted those risks. That means we don't have to go through breach notification. There's no liability for this sort of thing. Plus, once the patient receives their information, that's their problem. If they lose it, that's certainly not on us. Just like giving them paper and they walk out the door and the wind blows it away, that's not our problem. Now, we are responsible for breach notification for unsecured transmissions and may be liable for impermissible disclosures of PHI that occur in all contexts, except when fulfilling an individual's right of access under HIPAA, under the specific CFR aspect of HIPAA, to receive his or her PHI or to direct the PHI to a third party in an unsecured manner. In fact, we're supposed to. If the patient says, send my information to my new doctor, I've moved to, I don't know, San Francisco, and we say, no, we're not going to do it, that's their health information. Even if we have to send it non-encrypted, if they request it and they sign off, I don't care, we need to send it. Now, moving away from that, communicating, and that's new, by the way, what I just read, that's some new patient rights to their information. I mean, ideally, you would want them to log into the portal and get it that way. They could download it themselves. But does that, moving from patients, can we communicate business to business, provider to business, provider to provider, clinic to clinic, that kind of thing? Yes, absolutely. Same basic concepts as long as we put in reasonable safeguards. This is a slippery slope. We got to be very careful with what we're transmitting, how often we do it. You know, I highly recommend using encryption, but if it's very nominal stuff, it's generally acceptable, but we would need to do a risk assessment on what we're doing. And I do a whole nother webinar on emailing and texting of what we can and can't do. But again, there's a lot to consider. Do we need to encrypt, yes or no? It's not a clean-cut answer always. So let's talk about bring your own device. This is becoming more and more common in 2019. Again, we will see more of this being done. And when you do your risk assessments, don't forget about personal device use. That's often overlooked. People getting email from personal devices, that kind of thing. Now, the conundrum of use of personal devices, highly effective, cheap to use, easy to use, but there are risks and manageability concerns. Provides flexibility, streamlines communication. One could make the argument you're more productive because you're familiar with, say, your Mac or your Android or whatever it is. Can save you money, especially small businesses. This is honestly becoming the norm, not the exception, especially with small businesses. Because who doesn't really have a phone these days or a laptop? I mean, you're not paying for that anymore. You're not paying for the equipment and the data plans. Allows for easier teleworking. Preferred by most staff members, and employees can use apps that they prefer for productivity. Who's responsible for support or repair? How do you know these things are secured? What about compatibility problems? How do you know they're not downloading information to that device? So if you're doing this, you need to have clear, concise policies on personal device use. This would be my requirement. So let me preface that first. Ideally, we want to engineer out any ability for folks to download protected health information to personal devices. That's an ideal world. If there was a way our cloud-based system totally prevented us from downloading anything, that would be great. That's just not how things are in reality. Therefore, we have to assume people have the ability to download. So my requirement would be, first, let's start with personally owned smartphones. By policy, everyone must sign off on this personal devices policy that they will encrypt their phone with a PIN or biometrics. Because what if they don't, they're getting email on their phone. You may have PHI in the business email. So phones have to be encrypted. iPhone is simple. Just turn the PIN on, it's encrypted. An Android, you have a few extra steps, but it's easy. If it's a Mac, turn encryption on. Already comes with it built in. Now, when we get to Windows laptops, it gets a bit more complicated. If it's my business, my practice, you must have, number one, a professional grade operating system, Windows 8.1 Pro or newer, because the professional grade operating systems provide whole disk encryption. It's known as BitLocker. Also, the professional grade operating systems have better firewalls and better overall security of the operating system. Secondly, I would require you must have a business grade enterprise level security suite installed on that machine, meaning antivirus, anti-malware, anti-spam, the whole thing. Not just some free consumer grade antivirus that you've got for free. No, that's not robust. That is not adequate to be using in a business or a medical practice environment that's accessing, transmitting, or storing any PHI. That would be my requirements. I would not allow someone to use a Windows home-based operating system unless we could completely engineer out their ability to download anything to it, which we would hope that's the ideal, but it's not always possible to do that. When we do our risk assessments, don't forget about the BYOD. Make sure latest and greatest security updates are on. Multi-factor authentication. Encrypt using whole disk encryption because a lost or stolen encrypted device is not a reportable breach under HIPAA. Also, education. You can't be HIPAA compliant without educating your staff. We talked about this earlier. And the better educated they are, the more likely they are to secure their own personal stuff too. So we really need to talk about proper education relating to cybersecurity threats, regardless if it's personally owned or not. Good passwords on, say, laptops for your, when you log in, the decrypt key, the password should be at least 8 characters and complex. Do your risk assessments annually. Your number one compliance worry with portable devices in general, not just personally owned, but theft. It is theft. This guy will steal it and put it in his little bag, so therefore encrypt the thing. Now, there are other things you could turn on some iPhones. You got remote tracking, remote disabling, remote memory wipe, those sorts of things. But the bottom line, the most important aspect is encryption. Now, some groups may have what's known as, mobile device management, which is really nice to have. But normally that would be for business-owned phones that enforce them to be encrypted if they're going to access email. But it's just not, we don't all have that. Smaller businesses aren't really going to have mobile device management centrally, governed like that. But that would be ideal to have. Texting, there has been a pretty significant change with what we can't do here with texting. Now, believe it or not, I am a proponent of using texting if it's done appropriately. Now, let's ask the federal government. Can we use texting to communicate PHI? Government's answer is it depends. Bottom line, no, not unless it's encrypted. Now, you can text directly with patients with consent, non-encrypted. Absolutely. You can text with patients with consent, non-encrypted. Now, interorganizationally, you guys need to put in a third-party encryption app if you guys want to communicate with each other, which is simple. Remember what I said, reasonable and appropriate. It's about $5 a month or so for an encryption app for texting. There's a lot of them that are specifically made for medical. In fact, I vetted a lot of these different companies. There's a bunch of them out there. So if you want to text, if it makes sense for you in your organization, you need to download, to agree on one, download it, and